So the BBC North America, the New York Bureau, requested an interview of me not that long ago, a day or so ago, and they sent me some questions to respond to. And goodness knows when the article may drop, but I thought I'd give you some previews to the answers to the questions that the BBC North America office sent to me regarding the World Cup and the Olympics, these mega events. So, question one was, how do the World Cup and the Olympics compare in terms of economic impact on local businesses, residents, governments, and hospitality industries like hotels, etc.? So my answer to that is, that major events like the FIFA World Cup and the Olympics have many common features and several subtle differences. Both events are global in scale, and the host cities, of course, will benefit from increased economic activity in localized areas. Historically, the Olympics have required more in terms of expenditure on infrastructure like stadium and facility upgrades, athlete accommodations, and sometimes even transportation network upgrades. Many of these expenditures are funded publicly through tax dollars. So I point out, as with any policy decision, each taxpayer may hold a differing view on the value for public expenditure on different programs. Some may argue that investments in the area of sports venues, transportation infrastructure, and other valuable development in the city is going to have a long lasting positive financial effect well beyond the end of the event. Some research, however, suggests that the cost associated with facility upgrades will not benefit the city going forward, reporting that sports facilities are not generally expected to generate additional net output in a metropolitan area, and there'd be no systematic empirical analysis that's ever found evidence that they do. Transportation infrastructure repair and improvement is an ongoing need, meaning that it's likely that such expenditures would have taken place eventually, regardless, of course, of the host situation for a global event. Recently, the hosting duties for the World Cup have been split up between several cities across three host countries in the most recent case, which adds a geographic element to the World Cup that did not exist decades ago. There are, of course, benefits and drawbacks to having this dispersion of host cities for the World Cup. To an extent, the same is true for the host cities of Olympics, where competitions for certain events are held in venues in the surrounding cities and countryside. Some of the businesses that benefit the most from the Olympics and the World Cup will be common to both mega events. For example, tourism, bars and pubs, accommodations, transportation services, and of course, local restaurants are going to do well. To some extent, the Olympics and the World Cup is going to have some different intensity of those benefits, since the Olympics tends to concentrate many events within a 2 week period, and the World Cup is often a more prolonged event lasting sometimes over a month. There's also some businesses that are not going to benefit from hosting such events. Generally, when the consumer's discretionary spending is directed towards this one time Olympic or World Cup event spending, it's diverted from other entertainment options. Additional negative externalities from hosting World Cup games or events at the Olympics can be thought of as direct consequences of those positive effects that we mentioned before. For example, the increased tourism may lead to increases in criminal activity and or injuries, traffic accidents, etc., which may require additional policing and emergency services, which are costly. Expenditures that improve infrastructure while creating economic activity and jobs in the lead up also have associated costs. Some estimates for Toronto, just to be able to host 6 matches in 2026 World Cup, were 380 millions in terms of cost to the taxpayer. Then there's the issue of the opportunity cost of capital. So, plainly said, there are alternative uses for the funds invested in the presentation of a mega event. One might ask, are there better uses for taxpayers' money? For example, that capital directed to the mega event could have been invested in education, healthcare, homelessness prevention initiatives, and a plethora of any other worthy social welfare concerns. The second question that was posed to me is either event ever economically worth it for the host city in terms of the money the government contributes to putting on the events, how much they make back from ticket sales, and how much it boosts the local economy. There are some differences, of course, between the Olympics and the World Cup in terms of whether or not it's worth it for host cities. Let's begin with the Olympics. And the short answer is more than likely no, it's not worth it. Traditionally, infrastructure investment using public funds is very high in preparation for Olympic Games, often in the tens of billions of dollars. Ticket, broadcasting, and sponsorship revenues are not entirely kept by the hosts. The IOC, the International Olympic Committee, retains much of the revenue from those sources. The revenue streams that the hosts keep is often not even sufficient to cover costs. It is often the argument that the additional economic activity and global exposure that is associated with the Olympics will make up the difference in the longer term. And we find that this tends not to be the case, as evidenced by the lack of any Olympic Games since 1960 turning a profit. One of the very prominent examples of an Olympic Games that lost money was the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal. Of course, most of us are aware that it took over 3 decades to pay off the debt incurred as a result of hosting those games. Additionally, Olympic Stadium became somewhat of a white elephant for Montreal. It was an underused, expensive to maintain stadium for the city. Not unlike Montreal's Olympic Stadium, many of the venues in other Olympics, notably the 2016 Rio Olympics, have fallen into disuse and have become expensive to maintain. Comparatively, the FIFA World Cup has a somewhat better financial outlook for host cities. Often the infrastructure cost to prepare for hosting a World Cup is much less than it is for the Olympics. Sometimes less than $1 billion in upgrades are necessary because those stadiums often already exist. So, nations that have stadiums, advanced transportation networks, and abundant accommodations have the ability to host seamlessly. As I mentioned earlier, some of the revenues will divert to the governing body, in this case, FIFA, in terms of ticket, broadcasting, and sponsorship revenues. In either case, some argue that breaking even is a wild success for the Olympics and a moderate success for the World Cup. An argument is often made that the real benefits are gained through the investments made in infrastructure, increased tourism, and other such longer term and difficult to measure factors. The third question that was posed to me by the interviewer was, what kind of business and financial impact do you think this World Cup in 2026 had on cities across the US and Canada? Well, there's going to be many positive effects to the cities from hosting a portion of the World Cup in 2026. The most obvious is an increase in economic activity in the city that's due to increased tourism and the expenditures on developing specific infrastructure improvements. Of course, with such increases in economic activity, there is an associated, um, you know, job creation in the lead up to and during the event. Each of these host cities for the World Cup 2026 are likely to see similar benefits, though with differing intensities. Very strong short term financial gains have been seen in the accommodation sector, the restaurant sector, and the tourism sector for most of the cities. Obviously, some spillover effects are going to occur into the metropolitan area businesses and other entertainment venues that are nearby where the action is occurring. Longer term financial gains are much more difficult to quantify, but theoretically, we would expect a positive financial effect from infrastructure investment in cases where those improvements do not deteriorate quickly. Overall, it's not only the financial impact that creates a positive or ongoing benefit to those cities. Other positive effects are somewhat less quantifiable, yet perhaps as important to the city. One could argue that the image of the city will be enhanced internationally with a successful presentation of their games. Theoretically, at least, the spotlight on the host cities could lead to increased tourism long after the event is completed. Further positive benefits from hosting would include the sense of pride of belonging to the host city and generally the nation as a whole, and what they'll experience of being a part of the world football community uh, will bring. Canadian American youth may be inspired to dedicate themselves in the pursuit of excellence in sport because they are inspired by Team Canada or the US men's national team and the pride of a home World Cup. Overall, I would assert that the 2026 World Cup was a financial success for some local businesses in the area of tourism, accommodations, restaurants, and pubs. The host cities benefit to the extent that there was some increased economic activity for their community, and potentially as a result of the value of the long term infrastructure put in place and funded by the wider national tax base. The fourth question posed to me was are there any businesses that are actually going to lose revenue during either of these mega events? And yes, that does occur. In fact, some of the economic activity, quote unquote, generated by the World Cup or Olympics isn't really new economic activity at all. We can easily imagine the displacement of a consumer's economic activity from one expenditure to another. One might spend $500 per month on various sources of entertainment, like, I don't know, paintball, movies, baseball games, or axe throwing. That individual might forego their normal spending on entertainment and instead spend the $500 on the World Cup during that month or so that it's in their city. No new economic activity has occurred, rather, it's been transferred to the World Cup from alternative forms of entertainment. There might also be a geographic element to the benefits of increased economic activity. Obviously, businesses near the event are likely to benefit from simply existing near the action. Typical examples of businesses that lose revenue when these events come to town are businesses that are outside of the geographical area of the event, and businesses for which the event might serve as a substitute, as we discussed before. The sixth question, how much of the spending by visitors is actually going to stay in the local economy of the host city? Well, whether the proceeds of that increased activity is going to remain in the host city depends on how much leaks out. For example, if a hotel's owned internationally and spends the after tax benefits that it receives from increased tourism in the host city somewhere else, well, then the host city's benefit from the increased activity is somewhat muted. Some economic studies estimate that the capture rate is somewhere in the range of 35 to 55% and is going to depend heavily on the mix of spending done in locally owned versus internationally owned firms. Most of the money leaving the local economy goes to the governing body in terms of their share of ticket prices, broadcast and sponsorship revenues, um, and other incidental fees. The larger portion of what remains locally is revenues generated by locally owned small business. And finally, the last question: who typically benefits the most economically? Residents, businesses, governments, or FIFA? Well, as the governing body, FIFA is the biggest winner financially, and it's not even close. Without getting into the minute detail, the revenue flows to FIFA are gigantic, and the cost of carrying out the tournament is very low. It lands largely with the host city. So, you know, the simple math tells us a very high revenue minus a very low cost equals extremely high profits. Sponsorship rights, licensing, and global broadcasting rights all fall to FIFA, along with a large portion of the associated revenues, and nearly all of the costs are passed on to the host cities. In answering the prior questions, of course, I've outlined that businesses can benefit from additional economic activity depending on several factors that we mentioned, like geography in relation to the event and the overall industrial mix, whether that's locally or internationally owned. However, those potential benefits are dwarfed by the benefits that are accruing to FIFA. Given that all but the largest cities have begun to shy away from bidding on the Olympic Games in particular, an interesting point to consider is to what extent governments should be willing to spend public funds on such mega events. This is, of course, a matter of some debate. Perspectives on government expenditures to support sporting and cultural events are as varied as we are as individuals. Many feel that sports and culture are essential to the human condition, and they see a place for the government to provide these hosting opportunities as sort of quasi public goods. Others oppose public expenditure on such endeavors, favoring rather expenditure that enhances the social safety net, or indeed for the expenditure to be directed into a tax reduction. And so, this is the full extent of the interview that I performed for BBC North America. I'm interested to see how the article shapes up. Thanks for watching.